So, the Elephant in the Room project. This is the project that was conceived by Tony Palomba of Survival Education Fund. And it's comprised of a group of peace and justice organizations that aim to utilize the upcoming Democratic primary to pin down the leading Democratic candidates and address the elephant in the room, which is this staggeringly large Pentagon budget. So we're certainly in a portentous moment of what seems to be political realignment, not just for the US, but for globally, for the world in general. And economists and analysts point to so many uprisings around the world, from Chile to France to Iraq to India. Apparently, people are revolting against neoliberalism and certainly reacting to this apparent age of extremes that we find ourselves in. Now, here in the US, we are certainly the ramifications of these extreme situations are manifested in that certainly we are the most powerful and the wealthiest country in human history. And yet we live in an age of unprecedented inequality, not only with 140 people in poverty and these epidemics, this epidemic of deaths of despair, but we are seeing certain demographics have a fall in both living standards and life expectancy. That's never seen in industrialized nations except during war. Another extreme is we have a demagogue as president, and some call him a pathological liar and certainly a bigot, and he is definitely the most dangerous US president that we've ever had. And he seems to be hell-bent on destroying any chances of proper human civilization as he gleefully enriches the billionaire class. So perhaps many of you have seen that just a few days ago, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands on the doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight. And this is the most dangerous situation humanity has ever faced because we have nuclear war, the threat of that's increasing. We have the climate crisis, and yet they are compounded by a threat multiplier, a cyber, as a bulletin calls it, the cyber-enabled information warfare that basically undermines society's ability to respond to these existential crises. And yet, there's an opening. We have new progressive leaders in Congress that do acknowledge and call out this bloated military budget and the forever wars. And so we're in an all hands on deck moment. We're here to actually learn from one another and seize the moment so we can confront the candidates when they come up for Super Tuesday in the coming weeks and challenge them with the necessity of redirecting war money to fund human needs. So the panels that are going to start now, the first one is, well, let me outline just generally. We're going to talk first about US military spending and also the cost to society and human costs with Bill Hartung and Neta Crawford. The second panel that will follow is going to turn our focus on the impacts on our domestic spending. And we'll hear from Lindsay Koshgarian and Senator Jamie Eldridge, State Senator Jamie Eldridge, to discuss how that Pentagon budget is actually impacting us here in Massachusetts. Then the third panel will start to get into the meat of what we really want to do to take action. We're going to hear from Savannah Wooten, who is very graciously come all the way up from DC. She's with Public Citizen and also a consortium of peace groups called the People of the Pentagon. And so we're going to hear from her what exactly the candidates have been saying. What specifics have they given, and what do we need them to elaborate upon? And finally, Tony Palomba of Survival Education Fund will conclude the panel sessions and explain how we can synthesize all this information and take action in the coming weeks as the presidential campaigns descend on us for Super Tuesday. So that's going to be the panel sessions, and then we'll split into the 4 breakout sessions in order to lay out the next steps. So the breakout sessions are kind of split up into 2 groups. There are 2 breakout sessions that will involve sort of mulling over people's thoughts and answering the audience questions about the military and domestic budget resources, which is sort of going to be a continuation, an opportunity to really answer questions, ask questions, and get answers in depth from Lindsay, Bill, and Neta. And likewise, we're also going to have a breakout session, which is very important for us in Massachusetts, that John King is going to facilitate. John King, who is also the chair of the Mass Peace Action board, is working with the Poor People's Campaign, and he's going to describe their moral budget, and it's specifically as applied to Massachusetts. So a moral budget for Massachusetts, and again, trying to figure out how to confront the candidates with our questions. So in addition to those 2 sort of informational and brainstorming sessions, the other 2 will focus on tactics that we'll be using in the coming weeks. In other words, tactics with which to target the candidates' public events and to use the media to our advantage. And I will call attention to your packet. So there's this sheet that says Get Involved. And the Get Involved sheet, basically we would like you to think about what roles you would like to take or play in this oncoming campaign, in our project. So we're going to ask you to fill this out and hand it in by the end of the forum. And those two sessions are going to address for example, talking about bird dogging. We have Arnie Albert from New Hampshire Peace Action, who is
American Friends Service Committee.
Sorry, my mistake. American Friends Service Committee from New Hampshire, though. And he has basically is the one who has devised the entire tactic of bird dogging. So we're really pleased to have him. And then we will also like folks to participate in the media breakout session with Becca Glenn and Louise Coleman, so that we can learn how to effectively write letters to the editor, call into local talk radio shows, and getting our message out through the media and certainly to our electorate. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Bill Hartung. And Bill is, he's come to us from the Center for International Policy, and he's going to be talking about, generally, this crazy military budget, and then we'll hand it over to Neta.
So I want to thank the organizers. I think we couldn't be working on a more important issue at a more important time, and I'm glad that it's focused on action. A lot of times I'll give these long, detailed speeches about the evils of the military-industrial complex, and then people will say, well, Bill, what are we going to do about it? And of course, one person can't answer that question, so it's good that we're here together to figure that out and to move forward on it. I was at Riverside Church this week for the commemoration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And being at Riverside Church, of course, that's where he gave his famous speech against the war in Vietnam, which was his most public embrace of the peace movement and the anti-war movement up to that point. And he took a lot of criticism for it, including from some mainstream civil rights leaders, from the New York Times, Washington Post, that he was sort of getting out of his lane. Peace and civil rights don't mix, and he was going to undermine support for civil rights by taking a position on such a controversial issue. And you can read or listen to that speech. He pretty much demolished that argument in great and eloquent detail. And it was a speech that wasn't just about Vietnam, it was about abolishing the war system. and he talked about the evil triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, which are still with us, along with, of course, the dangers of the climate crisis. And at the event, it was interesting. There were well over 1,000 people there, and it was still a moderately polite crowd. You know, a smattering of applause here and there. But then there was a panel with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that addressed specifically King's Riverside Church speech against Vietnam. And at the end of that discussion, there was a standing ovation. So I think these issues resonate now more than ever. And as we'll hear over the course of the day, they're being picked up by a broader and broader swath of groups, not just the traditional peace movement. So, why would we want these candidates to address Pentagon spending? And of course, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is Congress has been falling down on the job. We're at $738 billion, one of the highest levels in history other than World War II and the peak of the Iraq and Afghan wars, but higher than Korea or Vietnam or the Reagan buildup, huge sums that could be spent for better purposes. And yet Congress, there were significant hopes with the Democratic House that we could make a dent in this massive flow of money to the Pentagon. But basically, Trump came in with his opening bid was $750 billion. Early in the process, the Democrats' leadership said, well, 733, so a fairly tiny difference, and they settled on 738 billion. So it basically went through almost without a fight. Then the argument was, well, but there's all these great policy changes that are in the defense bill, and that's really what we're fighting for and why we signed off on this kind of high number. And it was things like ending U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, having to come to Congress before starting a war with Iran, not building a new low-yield, more usable nuclear weapon, stopping Trump from deregulating the export of firearms. So by the standards of recent Congresses, some real potential changes. But basically, the Democrats gave in to the combined power of the Republican Senate and the president. All those were stripped out. So that rationale for giving in on the money thing just didn't play out. The question is then, what are the consequences of letting this happen? And of course, one of them is the wars. King spoke about Vietnam. We don't have a war of that scale at the moment, but there's at least 7 major wars and dozens of places where the United States has special forces deployed and does training and gets involved in combat operations and so forth, and of course uses drones. Places like Iraq and Syria and Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, much of North Africa. And these wars, as Neta will probably talk about in more detail, have resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths on all sides, thousands of U.S. service people killed, hundreds of thousands of veterans with either physical wounds or traumatic brain injuries or post-traumatic stress syndrome. So there's been a huge cost to be paid, not to mention $6.4 trillion spent or obligated, which could have done tremendous amount to rebuild this country, to invest in diplomacy, to make the world a better place. And of course, we've been starving domestic needs in the process. And in his Riverside Church speech, King talked about how the anti-poverty programs that had been an upshoot of the civil rights movement were basically cast aside because of the war. And he said, I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds in anti-poverty efforts so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men, skills, and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of that that is all too relevant today. We'll hear from Lindsay Koshgarian, who I'm sure will go into significant detail about the domestic costs of these huge budgets. But suffice to say, we spend more than half our discretionary budget on the military. We've got millions of people in poverty in this country. We spend far more on means of destruction than on means of uplift, and we have a long way to go. And Massachusetts is right in the middle of this. Massachusetts taxpayers spend about $12 billion a year subsidizing the Pentagon, at the same time when we share here all of the problems of poverty and people not being able to make ends meet and inadequate social support and so forth. So, I think it's an issue that strikes home all over the country, every city, every town, every state. And I think what's being done here can be a model for other places. So, of course, somebody's got to benefit from all this. And, if you're Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, you're doing pretty well. A lot of times when we try to cut the Pentagon budget, they say, well, what about the troops? What about the veterans? In fact, half or more of that $738 billion a year goes straight out the door to these corporations. And the top five alone split about $100 billion a year. Lockheed Martin, in a good year for them and a bad year for us, could get $40 to $50 billion of our tax money, which is larger than the budget of the U.S. State Department. So it's just another example of how skewed our priorities are. And if you're at the top of one of those firms, you're raking in money, which is basically our tax money, at an alarming rate. So the top five companies, their CEOs alone split about $100 million in salary every year. And if you look at the chief financial officers and all the other officers and what they pay their boards, and you look at a larger number of companies, we're talking billions of dollars going to weapons industry executives. And there's very little accountability for what they do. I know there's been a lot of work done here on Raytheon and the role of Raytheon weapons in Yemen, things like bombing funerals, all kinds of civilian strikes with these Raytheon-produced weapons. And the company has paid no price. In fact, Amnesty International and some others have tried to get these companies to comment on how they feel about the fact that their weapons are being used to slaughter people. And their answer is, well, we're just doing what the government told us to do. Complete moral bankruptcy. And of course, they're not passive bystanders here. They're spending millions and millions of dollars to influence Congress. They've got their people in high positions of power in the government, like our Secretary of Defense, who was former head of government relations, essentially the chief lobbyist for Raytheon. This administration in general has brought in more weapons industry executives to make security policy than any other in living memory. So the military-industrial complex is alive and well and intensifying its efforts, much to the detriment of the rest of us. And then finally on that point, of course, the argument's always made, well, but it creates jobs, and therefore that justifies everything else. But military spending is the worst way to create jobs of anything we could do. Infrastructure, investment, green energy would create about one and one half times as many jobs. Education, about twice as many jobs. The problem is political will. If you're working on a submarine in Groton, Connecticut, and your choice is $1 billion in government contracts or nothing, you're likely to go for the contracts. If there's something else going on, if we're investing in the Green New Deal, if we're investing in resilient and sustainable infrastructure, then there's somewhere to go. There's a constructive activity, constructive employment. It'll take a lot of work at the local and regional levels, a lot of planning for this transition, but it has to happen. But I don't think we can use jobs as a reason to continue down the course that we've been going. So what is to be done, as somebody once said? Well, we have you can tell the age of the crowd, right? Not that we were here when
No, we were. Some of us were.
Well, I looked it up in the history books. But anyway, we have, at the Center for International Policy, we have a group called the Sustainable Defense Task Force, which is a combination of experts from NGOs, former White House budget officials, congressional budget analysts, former Pentagon officials, retired military. And we had a modest proposal that said we could cut $1.2 trillion from the Pentagon over the next 10 years if we stopped fighting the wars like the Iraq and Afghan wars, cut the size of the armed forces by at least 10%, reduced our overseas military bases, stopped this insane nuclear weapons buildup we're in the middle of, got rid of huge bureaucracy. The Pentagon employs 600,000 private contractors, many of whom they don't even know what they're doing. In fact, when Robert Gates was defense secretary, he said he didn't have a good count of how many of these contractors they were employing. So those kinds of measures would save. But if you look at, for example, the work Institute for Policy Studies and Lindsay Koshgarian have done on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign Moral Budget, they talk about ways to save as much as $3.5 trillion over 10 years. So there's a lot of proposals on the table. There's a lot more activity on this issue than I've seen in a while. Not only is it a main plank of the Poor People's Campaign, we're going to hear from Savannah Wooten about people over Pentagon. There's the Pentagon Budget Campaign, which I've been part of, which is a coalition of groups from across the political spectrum who's been fighting the good fight on this issue. And there's a lot of groups, as I think I mentioned, that don't normally address this, that have been part of one or more of these efforts, like 350.org and important immigration groups that have political clout with progressive candidates like Indivisible and Move On, and you'll hear more about that. For the candidates, we've heard a little bit. I'd like to hear a lot more. There have been a few questions squeezed into the debates. One of them, unfortunately, was right before a commercial break, which of course is more important than the future of humanity. And Pete Buttigieg basically kind of evaded the question. He said, well, of course, our strategy and our spending have to be aligned, but didn't really explain what his strategy was. And of course, if he had a strategy that was about defense rather than offense, yes, you could save a lot of money, but he didn't really go there. Elizabeth Warren has talked about cutting the war budget, which has been used not just to spend for the wars, but to subsidize all kinds of other projects, which would save about $800 billion over 10 years. Bernie Sanders has raised the issue of transferring money from global military spending to addressing the climate crisis. Both Warren and Sanders have talked about the greed of the contractors, ways to rein them in. If they were consistent about it, even folks like Joe Biden, who's hasn't been surprisingly shouting from the rooftops about cutting the Pentagon budget. If you look at some of his positions, like reinstituting arms control, he talks about ending the forever wars, although the details are a little hazy. But if some of those principles were carried out, we could certainly push to spend less than we're spending now. So what to do about it is going to be the subject of the rest of today's conversation. But I think we are at a moment where we can do something about this, especially because there's more focus on our national needs, be it healthcare, be it the environment. There's big plans being put out on the Democratic side that are going to cost money, and the Pentagon is one of the places we can get that money. So in addition to being safer, without fighting endless wars, without building more nuclear weapons, we can also, I think, invest in the urgent needs that we have here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bill. So I think that we're going to open up for questions now. Is that the plan, or do we want to keep on and just have a session of questions later? Yes? Yeah. Okay.
Keep on.
Keep on. All right. So Neta Crawford. Neta is the chair of, remind me.
Political science.
Political science at BU. Sorry, my notes folded up as I was looking at the timer. Chair of political science, and she's also with the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute. So take it away, Neta.
Wow, I was introduced as the chair of a political science department, when actually the thing that I really care about is not being the chair of a political science department. I've been an activist for 40 years, and that's what I care about. It's not being an administrator. Yes, I am a political scientist. Now, why am I going back to the activism? Because it takes, what Bill said reminded me of why I do this work. And part of why I do this work is I ask the question myself 40 years ago, is it possible to end war? And if I was to ask you, is it possible to end war, how many of you would raise your hands? Do you think it's possible to end war?
Yes, of course.
Okay, raise your hand high. I want to know what proportion. Okay, that's a good proportion of you. Now, do you think you're representative of the rest of America? Okay, I don't think so either. And this is important because many of us are convinced that war is the only option, and that's why Pentagon military spending is so high. Not only is it that we're convinced that war is effective, we're told that it's not only effective, it's efficient, it's controllable, that it's potentially more inexpensive or it's cheaper than the alternatives, and that it's going to be productive for the economy, which Bill mentioned, and that it will be low in casualties. We're told all these things about war. We were promised that the war in Iraq would be $50 billion in 2002 by Mitch Daniels, and then he criticized Larry Lindsay, who said it might cost $100 to $200 billion. Now, we're well past that, as you know. And there's this sort of suspension of disbelief about all of these things, that war is more effective and controllable and less expensive than the alternatives, that it's going to be low in casualty. We sort of suspend disbelief. And we also think that war's over when it's over. Another one, another whopper. So what I'm arguing is war spending sort of drives military spending, which drives government spending, sort of. And if we go to the next slide, the Cost of War project looks at all of these areas. Alternatives, that is opportunity costs, the domestic political consequences, human rights, the budget, the lives lost, direct and indirect death, which I'll say a little bit more about, injury, and migration. So in terms of direct deaths, I've calculated, I do the numbers for direct deaths. It's about 800,000 people so far killed directly. Now, what is a direct death? It's bombs, bullets, and fire. Then there's this other problem, this other thing that happens, of course, which is indirect death. So when you destroy infrastructure, you destroy you hurt people's life chances and their inability to get care. So that's indirect death. We don't know the indirect death in these war zones. The best estimate we have is probably from the Geneva Declaration Secretariat, which suggests that it's a ratio of direct deaths to indirect deaths of 1 to 2, 1 to 4, 1 to 8. They're not sure. It depends on where you're talking about and what kind of infrastructure was there beforehand. So we don't make an estimate for that. But that's a significant factor here. Then we also have the millions displaced. That the Cost of War project is going to produce a new paper in the spring on the displacement problem, that is internally displaced people and people who are called refugees, some of whom have come back and then some of whom have left again from the war zones, the major war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you do the next slide, it says, my main argument here, that war drives military spending up, overall military spending, increases the deficit and long-term debt, increases veteran spending, increases homeland security spending, and energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions that are a consequence. Then it brings down, as Bill alluded to, State Department non-war spending. War-related spending in the State Department has actually grown, but the rest of the State Department budget is shrinking, as you know. And then there's the potential job creation that is lost. If you go to the next slide, it shows the spending in the wars, the major wars, from 2001 to the present. All right, you see that the Iraq War peaked in around 2008, 2009. And then the Afghanistan War peaked in their surge in 2009 through 11, 12, 13. That's been going down. Okay, so why is that important? Well, keep this in mind. The the war spending's going down, but something else is happening. Let's talk about the next slide, which shows you where we're engaged besides Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. This is based on information that Stephanie Savell compiled from looking at DoD reports, and it shows the 80 countries that she was able to confirm are receiving either troops or money or some other kind of assistance to fight in the global war on terror. So, but that's actually 80 to 90 countries, and we don't know. In fact, the Congress doesn't really know all of the activities. And of course, the global war on terror now includes Yemen and the Philippines and many other locations, significant military action, as well as lots of more fighting in Africa. And Stephanie Savell, the person who put this map together, has just returned from Burkina Faso, where the United States is engaged in global war on terror activities. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that what I'm trying to argue about, war spending drives military spending. So if you look at this chart, the top, the red, I hope it's red, is the OCO spending, Overseas Contingency Operation, emergency appropriations for war. You see that that goes up and down a little bit, which makes sense given what I showed you on the other chart, depending on what's going on in the war zones. But you also see that the base military budget steadily increases. In fact, in some years when when the overseas contingency operation spending goes down, base military spending stays the same or goes up. Most of the time, there's only 1 year that I found when base military spending decreased. Okay, what's the base budget? That's the enduring part of the budget. That's all that stuff like the 800 military bases we have, the 5,000 or so buildings on those bases, the pay of service members, and new equipment. All that stuff, that's in the base budget. Now, the base budget is essentially inflated by the wars, and there's a couple reasons why that happens. The most obvious one is Congress wants to give the Pentagon whatever they say they need. Okay, they want to salute and support the troops. The second reason it goes up is that the wear and tear on the military, and in fact on the humans, is such that they need more stuff. They need reset, more equipment, and they need more medical care. And they need more pay to keep them enlisted, and they need enlistment bonuses and re-enlistment bonuses. And in fact, re-enlistment bonuses have increased in quantity, that is number, total number, but in also the size of the bonus. So there you have it. The base budget is boosted by these factors. So war spending drives higher military spending. So then, if you go to the next slide, this is my calculation of the basic costs of these wars in the various categories. So basically, it's $2 trillion on the OCO, the emergency funding, and this is that's the top line. That's DoD and State Department together. With the overseas contingency operations spending at $2 trillion, that's basically the part of the iceberg we mostly pay attention to, right? That's the war spending, okay? But underneath the iceberg is what I'm showing you with the rest of this. So I've got the increases I've got the Pentagon spending broken out, and then I've got the State Department appropriations. Then we've got the base budget, which is, I'm estimating, has gone up about $800 billion. Then there's the medical and disability care for veterans. We'll talk a little bit about why that's so high. Please give me 2 more minutes to do the technical
There's
stuff.
one more after that.
Okay, thanks. Then we've got Homeland Security spending, which I've estimated now, that's related to the war on terror, not all of Homeland Security spending. That's about $1 trillion. Then we've got interest on borrowing. Because we've borrowed to pay for these wars, interest has gone up. We're paying interest. We haven't paid the principal on these wars. The United States was in budget surplus in 2000 to early 2001. We immediately went into deficit spending. So that's why we began to borrow. Now, let's move to the next slide, and you can see that there's a little pie chart that gives you the basics there. Okay, and then let's move to the next slide, since I'm told I have very few minutes left. I want to highlight here the Gulf War era veterans. So that means the people who went to the first Gulf War are lumped in with the people who have been in the post 9/11 wars. Why is that? Unclear. But that's an accounting problem that I have in telling you exactly everything that you need to know about these veterans. But the bulk of these Gulf War era veterans, 1990 to the present, are veterans who are in the veterans system who are receiving compensation, disability compensation, and so on. So they're now half. They will be an increasing proportion of the number of veterans receiving care, and that number will be in the many millions in 10, 15, 20 years. And as they age, their expenses increase. If you move to the next slide, you'll see that these veterans are, on average, more disabled than the veterans of previous wars. That's one of the reasons why their expenses will be higher. Okay, so the three biggest parts of the discretionary budget are DOD, the Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. That's why this is important. Veterans Affairs, veterans' needs will constitute another $1 trillion going into the future. That's what I've estimated. Or actually, Linda Bilmes has estimated, and I'm using her work. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, you see here what the DOD wants to tell you about the estimated costs of the wars for you as a taxpayer. And it's all in small print here, but my estimate, taking into account all of the things I've told you are beneath the iceberg, is much higher cost per taxpayer of these wars. Okay, so that there's a sort of hidden element to your taxation. Remember, we're not actually paying for the wars, we're borrowing to pay for the wars, but still that money's being spent, and you'll pay for it into the future. Okay, then the next slide really quickly is a comparison of U.S. War spending from the American Revolution to today, and I'm using constant 2016 dollars. Now, I had to make the dollars constant because obviously we spent a smaller total amount, let's say, in the Revolutionary War, but the dollars were something different then. Okay, so World War II is still our most expensive war, but the post 9/11 wars are fast approaching. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about the next slide. If we could do the next slide, it shows what Bill was talking about in terms of job creation. And here's the numbers on the ineffectiveness, essentially, of military spending. So we see that military spending produces 7 jobs directly and indirectly per $1 million spent. And if you look at other sectors, they're much more productive. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, and clean energy. All right, next slide, please. Then you can also see, as I said, military spending, that is, the military drives government energy production, consumption, rather. So the consumption on the top line there is total U.S. government energy consumption. What parallels it very nicely at 77 to 80% is DOD energy consumption. Right? So U.S. government energy consumption is essentially boosted. It's driven by DOD consumption. Next slide, you'll see that I've estimated U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by the Department of Defense, and they're huge. Okay? So, but you also see, if you look at the numbers, so I started in 1975, and I go to 2018 with the latest numbers, and guess what? Every time the U.S. draws down and closes military bases, the emissions by the Pentagon declines. So the big bumps are for wars. Okay, so there's not only a peace dividend when we go to peace, but there's a greenhouse gas dividend. Okay, so that is where I end, but I could have said a ton more. Ask me questions.
Now if I break into my stand-up routine, I can stand up. Yeah, we had 3 questions. I'll start with the audit. The Pentagon now is throwing some money at it, so it's costing more to find out that they don't know where the money is. And there's a guy named David Norquist, who's Grover Norquist's brother. Grover's the great tax cutter who wants to strangle the government in the bathtub and have nothing left to take care of us. But I think, there are some in the government who are trying to make a good faith effort. I think there's 2 aspects to it. One is they've got all these computers that can't talk to each other. It's this huge bureaucracy. To some degree, it's in the interest of many in the military-industrial complex for us not to know, because there's all kinds of fraud and abuse and cost overruns. And they don't want to go up to Congress and say, in their annual budget request, oh yeah, actually we've been wasting a lot of your money, so give us less, And then if we get an audit, which I think is well worth doing for going after waste and things like that, it doesn't change bad policy. If they do a new nuclear weapons buildup and give us the receipts, I'm not satisfied, But I think it's an interesting issue because in Congress there was a bill on this that had Bernie Sanders on one end and Ted Cruz on the other. So there is some concern across the board, but I think if we don't get at the war policies and the bad decisions about weapons, we won't get to our ultimate goal. So I think this is one tool along the way, but probably not the central one. In terms of people thinking that peace is impossible, there is an aspect of faith involved. I mean, there's no way to prove that we can have peace. But I think there's examples of diplomacy, of kind of on the ground, local peace building efforts. We have stopped wars with, mass protests and so forth. But yeah, I think a lot of it's about faith. And I think people are cynical that we can do anything, really, at this point. They don't trust government. Some of them don't trust their neighbors. So we have to get at that. We have to build trust at every level, I think, in order for people to think we could have an undertaking that important and succeed at it. In terms of the after-action reports, I think there's some interesting information in there, but it's narrowly focused. It's like, how could we have fought the war better? It's rarely about how could we have prevented the war in the first place. But I think those things should be surfaced because I think they'll show that in a lot of cases the military knows that the kinds of actions they've been taking not only are not succeeding, but have made matters worse in many cases. And the Afghanistan papers that the Washington Post put out basically showed that at many levels of government, they knew the war was failing, but they kept putting out PR and trying to pull the wool over our eyes about that fact. So I think, the Congress should be playing a stronger role in this, about whether these wars are necessary, much less effective. And I think we need better media coverage. I think the Cost of War Project has done a huge service because a lot of the things that they discuss were kind of vaguely discussed in the press or not discussed at all. To get a number of what the wars cost, it was very difficult. And now the numbers that the Cost of War has put out are kind of routinely in the press, at least the press that I read, which I think at least, that drives home one element of the costs and consequences of these conflicts, and they're digging into many of the other human costs. So I think information can make a difference even in this strange time we live in. I'm not going to use the term fake news because it's been used against us. But anyway, I do think concrete information shared in every way possible can turn around some of these attitudes.
Okay, so oh yeah, sorry, please, go ahead.
Sure. On the first point that Jamil raised about whether it is possible to end war and how skeptical people are about that, I think of this in terms of long-term normative change. And there are parallels. When we've had institutions that were taken for granted as normal, good, just, right, and productive, they have changed when people have denormalized them delegitimized them, shown that they're alternatives, and then institutionalized gains, small gains, in constraining those institutions and making those alternatives more viable. And of course, the institutions I'm thinking about are slavery and overt legal colonialism, right? So neither of those two institutions is normal. We see them as abnormal. We point out instances of slavery and neocolonialism as bad, whereas, for thousands of years, those were taken for granted as good, normal, just, right, productive, honorable things to do. So that's the normative answer for you. I think that the other thing that needs more beefing up is the alternatives to the war system. Sanctions, diplomacy, people-to-people activity. I'm disappointed that many of us, perhaps some of you, spend a lot of time trying to get a U.S. Institute of Peace. It's basically not much. We need to think about other institutions outside. When I talk about institutionalizing gains, we need to institutionalize mindsets about try diplomacy first, war is a last resort, and so on. What we have now is war is the tool that fits all problems. That's the mentality. And then in terms of cost effectiveness that you asked for, Mr. Thompson, I forgot your first name. Okay, so in terms of the cost effectiveness issue, there are more Al-Qaeda now than there were in 2001. There are more Taliban now than there were in 2001. The ISIS is new. I don't think that the Pentagon can argue persuasively that all the killing has worked and that they've eliminated terrorists or the problem of terrorism or of militancy. So I think that there's some simple questions we might ask, which is, how do you end the war on terror? What's your plan? Is it forever whack-a-mole, which actually harms many more civilians and increases militancy? Or have you got another idea?
Usually Nita has better answers, so you might as well start with me. Wow, good questions. I think the State Department, funding has gone down, they're not appointing ambassadors, the professional foreign service are fleeing in large numbers. So under a new president, I think we need to substantially increase funding for the State Department, but we also have to actively recruit diplomats. We have to make it clear it's an honorable profession. It's one of the most effective ways to deal with conflict in the world. So you would need a president who was making those points repeatedly and relentlessly, maybe trying to bring back some of the people who've left, because not all of them were at the end of their careers when they stepped out. I know a lot of young people would like to be in the State Department even now, but of course they'd rather be in one that's actually trying to solve problems. So I think that's important. I don't know exactly how to quantify the threat. I mean, I think part of the problem is the threat language and the generation of fear. They're focused on the wrong problems in many cases. The Pentagon, more so than the rest of the government, acknowledges that climate change is a problem, but it's got to be a national emergency, a national initiative on a huge scale, and it's a bigger risk to us than any of the conventional things the Pentagon keeps telling us about, as is the risk of nuclear weapons. So I think there's that. I think also the China threat has been overblown. The United States spends a lot more on its military than China, and more importantly, the problems we have to deal with, like climate change, like building a just global economy, would be far better approached by finding ways to cooperate with China than to spin out war scenarios of how to fight with China, which could well end life as we know it, given that they're a nuclear power. So all these Pentagon doctrines about striking deep into China, pushing our Navy right up against their borders, all of that is nonsense. But it's certainly something we're going to have to fight, because the Pentagon can always find a reason to spend money. at the end of the Cold War, they came up with the doctrine of two major regional contingencies. What if we had to fight Iraq and North Korea at the same time? And what would be the building blocks of that? Michael Clare at the time wrote a lot about that, book called Rogue States and Nuclear Outlaws. But they've always got a rationale to back up. Also, they never give anything up. So they're still going to be fighting the war on terror at the same time they're scaring us about China. And they're going to try to get money for both, which is why it's so difficult to bring the money down. In terms of military culture, I think we need to fight it in the cultural arena. When Trump killed Soleimani, the Iranian general, I think he thought it was like he was in a Western movie. I took out the bad guy. And he tried to sell it on those terms. He also started fundraising on it the day after it happened. So there is this kind of deep sense, and it relates to what Neta said. People think that war is somehow protecting us. And I think for a lot of people who are down on their luck or kind of downwardly mobile, for some of them, well, at least I'm part of the strongest country in the world. It's almost part of their identity. And the fact that strength is being squandered and used for the wrong purposes has not fully penetrated. So I think that's kind of an all-hands-on-deck problem with all the creative approaches we can imagine. But I think people in the field of culture have a lot to offer in that regard, more so than, say, somebody like Bill Hartung.
So these are all, every question so far or comment has been really interesting, and I'm really glad I came today to hear your thoughts. On diplomacy, I believe that, yes, the State Department's important, but I think back to the 1980s and 1990s and how we ended the Cold War, how people ended the Cold War. And that was, in part, the Western European peace movement and American activists supporting activism in Eastern Europe and creating a delegitimation of the whole process. And so people-to-people diplomacy, as they call it, or whatever the term du jour is, in other words, when we talk to each other and create relationships, that's very important in terms of putting pressure on governments and decreasing threats. Now, threats, quantifying threats. Okay, I went to MIT's Defense and Arms Control Studies program in the 1980s and early 1990s, and the way I was taught in what we called then the Bombs and Rockets program, to think about war, waging war, and right-sizing the defense budget and the Department of Defense's missions to the threats, was to think in terms of three things: costs, risks, and benefits within a grand strategy. Okay, so what we don't really have threats so much as we have risks, because the world is full of things that could hurt us. But we then have to quantify or qualify somehow risks. And do the things that we do make those risks grow or diminish? So that's how I think of it. I don't think of it so much as in terms of threats, because we have lots of possible threats. But now, if we think in terms of risks, what's 100% likely to hurt us? Climate change is 100% likely to hurt us. That's a high-risk event, high-risk proposition. So then you say, okay, if we want to make the world more secure, we turn our attention to that. But military spending is actually making that much more difficult to deal with. And in addition, because it's associated with greenhouse gases, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The way that the Pentagon thinks about climate change is as Michael Clare says in his newest book, all hell breaking loose. Climate change is going to lead to climate war. And then we must be prepared for that. Well, actually, we need to do the opposite. Because the Pentagon's greenhouse gas emissions are the equivalent of countries like Sweden and Denmark, or Portugal in any one year. But what are the other risks? And are our policies making those risks decrease, stay the same, or grow? And I think that the global war on terror has increased our risk of potential terror attacks, but we haven't seen very many of them, and we might ask why. Is it because we're killing people over there, or because Homeland Security is effective, or something else? And that's the kind of analysis I'd like to see coming out of the Congressional Research Service and think tanks, is what's actually making us secure. We know that Homeland Security is another black hole of money. They can't track what they're spending, but maybe they're actually doing good. We need to know more about that. And then in terms of international relations theory, which I teach, and realism, neoliberalism, and so on, I think back to a really interesting book published in the mid-1980s by Paul Kennedy called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And Kennedy's argument, I think, is actually more relevant today in a sense than it was in the 1980s. Kennedy argued that all great powers reach a point where they overreach, where they overextend. And all of this is in search of controlling everything, everywhere, all the time, to protect their resources, to protect their overseas bases, to protect their interests, however those interests are defined. And when they overreach, they do two things. They extend beyond the blood and treasure that their societies can afford or want to pay. Too much dying, too much money, and they diminish, therefore, their internal capacity, their infrastructure, their innovation, and so on. And they create enemies out there who don't like them, which gets us to China. We make others afraid of us. So Kennedy's book looks at mostly 1500 to the present, but we can go back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Ottoman Empire, and then move up, to the British and the French and the Habsburgs and the so on, right? So what you see is a cycle of rise, overextension, and decline. And if we look at the United States, I think we're in a moment where our policies are counterproductive. They're actually accelerating our decline. Realists care about decline, right? But that's all sort of happening. At the same time, we have the urgent moment that we're in of climate change. So we can't afford to be messing with decline. We have to survive.
So I'm going to try mostly not to talk about the military budget itself, since we already heard so much about that and a bunch of really good information. But I am going to talk about it as it relates to domestic spending. So as most of you have probably seen, the NPP pie chart, military spending is now at 54% of our federal discretionary budget. That figure has been shockingly consistent over a long time frame. It's been almost extremely rarely going below half of the federal discretionary budget over the last several decades. So this is not a Trump situation. This is a long-standing situation, and it's something that we're going to need to do some things differently if we want to fix it. One thing that we've calculated in our work with the Poor People's Campaign is not just a percentage of the military budget, of the discretionary budget that is military, but also the share of the discretionary budget that goes to anti-poverty programs, and that's kind of broadly defined. So that includes housing, pretty much all federal housing and homelessness programs. It includes all of our federal funding for public education. It includes massive amounts of our funding for federal nutrition programs and our scientific research and public health and lots of other things that we really want the government to keep doing and keep doing well and do more of. So when we look at that percentage of the discretionary budget, it's only 15%. And part of that is because in addition to the 54% that is just for the military, as we sort of typically understand it, there's another almost 15% or around 15% that is for some of the things that Nita was talking about at the end, for homeland security spending. A lot of immigration, a lot of our ICE spending and our border patrol spending and federal prisons. So a lot of sort of militarization at home also. And that only leaves 15% of the discretionary budget for poverty programs. Now, people who are on the conservative side always say, well, that's because we have this huge mandatory budget, which is true. We have big federal health care programs in Medicare and Medicaid, and they are quite costly. And we have a big retirement program and Social Security. But those programs only do two things. They only do healthcare and retirement. They don't do anything about housing. There is SNAP, the food stamps program, is a mandatory program, but it's much smaller than those others. So we have entire areas in education and housing and public health that are really not funded very much at all by the federal government, and to have to squeeze into that tiny 15% of the federal discretionary budget. And a lot of that is because our policy choices are that we're putting all this money towards both the military and the Department of Defense and the nuclear weapons and the Department of Energy, but also into Homeland Security now and into a federal prison system and all of what feeds into that, the court system and so many sort of apparatuses of really control and violence both at home and abroad. Now, one interesting thing is changing in the next couple of years when it comes to the federal discretionary budget, and that is that we are a mere 2 years away from freedom from the Budget Control Act. Now, the Budget Control Act, if you don't follow these things closely, is the 2011 law that most of us really kind of got to know and understand because of the word sequestration. Sequestration is the part where the federal budget will be slashed across the board without any kind of fine-tooth comb. But the Budget Control Act more broadly put caps on discretionary spending. And ever since sequestration first took effect in 2013, which was the thing that was never supposed to happen, Congress has gotten around it by every 2 years passing new budget agreements. So the most recent one was passed just last year in 2019. But because of the structure of the Budget Control Act, what happens is they always raise the military budget. They say that they raise the military budget equally with the non-military budget. They say that it's parity, but it's not. It's actually, because it's in percentage terms, they actually raise the military budget every time by more than they raise non-military spending. So every 2 years they go through this cycle where in Congress they negotiate, and it's sort of understood that Republicans obviously want higher military spending and Democrats want higher non-military spending, and those parts are true, but the fact is that Democrats are mostly also happy to have higher military spending. So it kind of keeps going through this process over and over again, and now we have in 2019, they passed a 2-year deal to raise both military and non-military discretionary spending over the limits set by the Budget Control Act. And so now we have those levels are set, and Congress can change them, but that would be a departure from what's happened in recent years. And it's most likely that they'll stay pretty close to what they are now, which is $738 billion for the military this year in 2020 and $740 billion next year in 2021. But after that, in 2022, when we may have a different president and may have a different Congress, the Budget Control Act will be over, and there will be new negotiating room in Congress for what the federal budget looks like at that point. So it's a little bit distant. It's after the 2020 election. It's a lot of other hurdles we have to kind of get past. But that point is something that we should have our eyes on as an opportunity to change the balance. For the first time, a bigger opportunity than we've had in the last 10 years since the Budget Control Act was effected. And one thing I want to say about that, the Budget Control Act, it was all about this fear of the deficit, right? We were coming out of the recession. There had been this big government stimulus spending, and there was the Tea Party phenomenon, which now feels like, it's the distant memory, but folks were really, their talk was all about the deficit. It was all about, we have to get the deficit under control, we've got to get the spending under control. And so I think that even though that's not the issue that we're here to talk about, we have to be really mindful and careful of that framing. Because what it tends to lead to every time is the balance being shifted, is the Pentagon being prioritized over domestic priorities. So I just want to kind of say that the deficit framing is kind of what gave us the Budget Control Act. And it's one of the many things that keeps us where we are now in terms of military spending versus domestic spending. Neta showed us her great work in the Costs of War project, does amazing work on the total costs of our wars over the last almost 20 years. And I just want to say that figure, that 6 trillion plus that we've spent in our spending on the wars, there was a study that came out last summer that estimated that the cost of changing the entire United States energy grid to renewable sources would be less than $4.5 trillion. So if 20 years ago we had made some different choices, we would have a renewable energy grid. We would have had it for years. We would be well on the way towards solving the climate crisis. That turns my stomach. And I just, it just sort of gives me additional urgency that we can't afford to keep making these choices. We're staring down a real emergency with climate change, and there is no equivalent in terms of any foreign policy threat, and we have to really get clear about that as a country. So Bill alluded to the Strategic Defense Task Force, which is one set of policies or set of ideas for how we might cut military spending. I know we're going to hear from people over Pentagon, from Savannah in a little bit, which has another set of policies, and at NPP, at IPS, we've developed another set, a way to cut $350 billion a year from the military budget. And there are sort of 3 major components of that. One is ending the wars. One is closing a bunch of our overseas bases. The United States has more than 800 military installations around the world, far more than any other country. We could close 60% of them and still have more than one for every country on Earth. So there's a lot of money that could potentially be saved there. And it's also, Ooh, okay. Did I touch something?
It might have just died. Okay, that one works, right?
All right. Yes. So there's a lot of money to be saved there, and I won't go into it too long because I know that we're pressed for time, and we're also here to talk about Massachusetts. The sort of third major prong is overhead costs, and this is something that it's not as sexy. It doesn't get a lot of attention. It's not as doesn't rile us up like thinking about nuclear weapons or the base in Okinawa that people on that island voted by 70% not to allow the United States to open a new location, and we're doing it anyway. But it's important, and it's important because the cost per troop of operations and maintenance for the military overall has gone up by 4 times since 1980. It's ballooned by a huge amount. And there are a few reasons for that. The Congressional Budget Office did a study, but even they weren't able to pinpoint all of the reasons, which goes to the issue of the $35 trillion and the failed audit and the fact that we don't know where a lot of this money is going. But the things that they could pinpoint were increased spending on oil and fossil fuels, increased spending on healthcare, and I think we can all, off the top of our head, think of a potential solution to that. And increased use of contractors for things like equipment maintenance. So there are clear solutions to each of those things. But part of what we have to do is kind of call those things out. And it's not as, it doesn't get our attention as much as some of the other things, but in terms of the dollars, it's huge. And it also ties into other things that we all really care about, like climate change and like Medicare for all or a better healthcare system. So we've developed that suggestion for $350 billion a year in military cuts, along with the Poor People's Campaign. And since we're here to talk about the presidential campaign in part, I want to point out that back in June, when there were quite a few more presidential candidates than there are now, the Poor People's Campaign had a presidential forum in Washington, D.C., and 9 of the candidates came. It included most of the major candidates who are still in the race today. Senators Warren and Sanders were there, and Joe Biden was there, and some others, many of whom are no longer with us. Not in that way, but out of those 9 people who showed up, 7 of them agreed that we need to cut the military budget. It was a direct question. Out of the 2 who didn't disagree, they actually were asked a multi-part question and picked up on other parts of the question. And so we actually know that both of them would have agreed as well. So there's agreement on this, but they haven't been pressed hard enough to actually make specific proposals. They haven't been pressed hard enough to talk about it more than they currently talk about it, more than any of them currently talk about it. And that's one of the things that's great about the People Over Pentagon campaign, is that that's exactly what that campaign is doing. So in Massachusetts, we're like many states. We get a lot of money in military contracts. We don't get as much money in military contracts as we pay in taxes for the military, but we'll set that aside for the moment. We get about $12 billion a year in military contracts to contractors here in the state of Massachusetts. By comparison, the Department of Education only sends $4 billion, so it's 3 times as much for military contracts as we get from the Federal Department of Education. And there's sort of support for, obviously some exceptions, but there's sort of support at multiple levels of government, right? There's certainly support from our federal delegation, our congressional delegation for bringing military defense dollars into Massachusetts. Even sort of some of probably our favorite presidential candidates, the ones who talk the most about cutting military spending, have at convenient moments in their past supported bringing the dollars into their own state or their own districts. And so it's extremely tempting. It's a very hard thing for legislators to work around. But it's not just at the congressional federal level, it's also at the state level. So Massachusetts has a quasi-governmental agency called Mass Development that does things like contract studies on how many jobs the defense industry creates in Massachusetts. And this is a state-supported endeavor, right? It's part of our economic development. And many, many states have this. I'm trying to do some work to figure out how many and what those look like. But many states have state-funded specific, task forces or boards or official bodies dedicated to helping to grow the defense industry in their states. I'm using the words defense industry on purpose because that's what they talk about. So there's big state support for this at a state level. And then there are also subsidies. States and local communities give subsidies to contractors who locate and create jobs in their communities. But all of this sort of just goes to the point that we're putting so much money into maintaining these jobs and into getting them to move here instead of there, If we put that money, like Neta's chart, if we put that money somewhere else into education or into healthcare, we would get services that we need, and we would create more jobs. And we could create a lot of those jobs in those same places. So there are answers to this. It's not easy, right? It's transitioning from one set of jobs to another set of jobs is not ever going to be a matter of snapping our fingers and saying, well, this just makes sense, so we have to do it. But we do have to do it. So I'm out of time, and I'm going to stop and hand things over.
So good morning. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge, and I really want to thank Mass Peace Action and Cole Harrison for inviting me here today. And I've either participated in or attended a number of Mass Peace Action events, usually this gathering every year. So thanks so much for inviting me, and very honored to be on this panel with Lindsay. And I particularly appreciate your comment about how involved the state government is in mass development is with sort of supporting or defending military jobs in Massachusetts, because I actually represent Devons, where mass development is. So I've sort of been directly involved with that, and I work directly with Cole Harrison and probably a lot of people here on opposing the so-called military bond bill that passed about 5 years ago in the legislature, which was $200 million operated or spent by mass development to support basically all of the military bases. But obviously we already have a massive problem with our federal taxpayer dollars going to the military budget, but a realization that even our state taxpayer dollars are going to support the military. And so I led the effort in the Senate to oppose that. Unfortunately, it did pass, but I thought it really raised some issues which Lindsay referred to a bit, is that every dollar that's going to be spent in the military is a dollar that's not being spent on education or healthcare or protecting our environment. And those are certain things I raised. I think there's a unique opportunity in talking about from the state perspective, because oftentimes it's a little easier to directly tie those expenditures to what we're seeing in our communities and our state. And I do really think that needs to happen more by advocates, by peace advocates, obviously to our federal congressmen and women, but also the state legislators, because I think there's actually in some ways more specific examples of how that money could be better spent. Hopefully folks have followed that the legislature last year passed the Student Opportunity Act, which will arguably be the biggest investment in K-12 public schools in about 30 years. It's about a $1.5 billion investment. Now we have to, of course, come up with the money each year in the budget to fund that, and revenues are looking a little bit lower than usual, and so we're already sort of being asked that question about how are we actually going to fund that $1.5 billion over the next 7 years. And I would argue that not only the federal dollars for spending the military, but at least some of the state dollars that right now are going to basically support our military bases could be used to fund education and so many other things. So my sort of very specific light bulb going off about sort of where all of our military money, where all the federal money is going to and where it's not going to was actually just over a year ago, December 2018, when there was the federal government shutdown. And the district I represent is the Acton, Maynard, out to Shirley near Devons, down to Westboro area, so sort of Metro West. So the Hanscom base is fairly close by, and the food pantries in my district, particularly the one in Maynard, Open Table, started hearing about how all the military servicemen and women who live at Hanscom, which is a relatively small number, but they, obviously not getting their to some extent not getting their paychecks, were really struggling to find food for their families. And so the food pantry actually worked with the military base to deliver food to the families, and just learning how little their pay is and how little financial support they get. And that just highlights what I think we all know is that, almost all of this money is just going for weapons of war and weapons of destruction, and not even going to really support military personnel and those that are, doing the work as officers or service people. So that's sort of an important thing to highlight, because imagine if all the federal dollars we were spending was going to address making sure people earn a living wage and access to healthcare and education, and not weapons of war. And I think it's really important to really highlight those sort of stories, because that's really how you're going to move elected officials. I think there is obviously massive peer pressure for elected officials, whether at the state or federal level, to always be supporting, quote unquote, our troops, right? Is to always saying, if you don't support the military budget that the president or Congress has proposed, that you're somehow not supporting our troops. And really trying to make the point about, first of all, how many of our troops are actually living, but also, how much better everyone's lives could be if we spent those federal dollars and state dollars on things that benefit a vast majority of people in this state. So I make that reference because going now sort of talking about Devens, and I'm sure people have followed what's happened at Devens, but basically the military base as it was closed in 1996. And now it is essentially an enterprise zone. It's a sort of economic development zone to attract companies, and it's run by Mass Development. There is still a training facility in Lancaster to train servicemen and women who are still going overseas and fighting in our different military conflicts. And I think what's happened at Devens is a good way to frame how we could better spend our money. Is that what you have at Devens now is you have housing that's been built. There's a number of public schools that serve children throughout that region. There are many companies they've created about 3,000 jobs. Actually, more people work where the base was than when it was a base. And sort of making that frame of if we actually invest those monies in public education and housing and protecting our environment, not only is it something that is supporting the people better, but it's a better return on investment. And I think that's a really important point that I certainly made where we were debating this military bond bill, is that there's an immediate assumption that money spent in the military is creating all these jobs, but actually the analysis and statistics and data really show that it actually doesn't create very many jobs compared to the investment. But what we do know is if we invest in education, if we invest in healthcare, protecting our environment, and sort of real economic development, say infrastructure, you're going to create many more jobs and actually create more security for people in general. So that was certainly a point that I made when the bond bill came up. I think we need to continue to make it because obviously that money is being spent now. And one of the things I did during that debate is I actually got a tour by one of the senior commanders at what is still a reserve U.S. Army training base at Lancaster, which is sort of the remainder of Fort Devens. And what I saw was, the most high-end buildings that were still being built. There's actually a village there made to look like an Iraq village for troops to be trained in, which was a little disturbing to see. I asked the senior commander, who wasn't particularly focused on what we were doing at the state level, so do you need more state money to improve these facilities? And he said, absolutely not. We have the most modern facilities from the federal government. We have no need for this state funding. So really trying to make the point of the transformative effect of taking those monies and investing in things that really benefit more of the public. And for anyone who hasn't been out to that area, one of the most beautiful things that really I think is such a powerful message for peace is that over half of that military base has been turned into the Oxbow National Wildlife Refuge. So it's a refuge, open, to the general public. It's something that's protected a number of species that were, under endangerment. And obviously, it's no longer being used as tools for war. So that was something that I really tried to highlight, because I do think that it's not just about criticizing how our taxpayer dollars are being used for the military and for war, but highlighting the fact that these are all the positive things that actually the public really supports, that can, I think, move people that are in the middle, that sort of reflexively, whether they're politicians or whether they're members of the public, just automatically assume that we need to spend more and more money in our military, and somehow to not do so or to oppose that is somehow unpatriotic. So the project that I'm working on at Devens right now is that, and I think it'd be a particularly powerful frame, is that there are officers' quarters at Devens that were abandoned when the base was closed in 1996. And now there's a proposal to build hopefully around 500 units of housing, most of it workforce housing. So housing, not this horrific luxury housing you see everywhere, but actually housing for working families in that region, which is also experiencing gentrification. And so, imagine the power of building that housing for hundreds of families in that region at a place that was once the quarters for military officers. So I think this is how we connect to people that, again, have that reflexive reaction to just support the military budget. This is something that I've begun to talk about with Congresswoman Lori Trahan, who succeeded Congresswoman Tsongas, so she represents that area. And so to what Lindsay highlighted as well, is that I do think there needs to be more direct conversations with both our federal but our state elected officials, because it can't just be at their town hall meetings. It really has to be organized groups of individuals, sitting down with congressmen and women, with state officials to make these points. I am a proud member of Progressive Democrats of America, and the chapter in our area did a lot of outreach. The Senate district I serve has 3 separate Congress persons representing it, but reaching out and getting these individuals to get behind Medicare for All, to get behind the Green New Deal, and really seeing that power of pressure that is moving Massachusetts congressmen and women to support these progressive policies. I'm generally underwhelmed by most of the Massachusetts congressional delegation. I'm always surprised that they're not stronger on cutting the military budget. It's one thing to co-sponsor Medicare for All, but what are you doing to really fight for Medicare for All? We've got Senator Markey leading the effort on the Green New Deal, but what are we doing to really organize behind those ideals? So I just sort of wanted to highlight the framing that I've used, and I do think it's really important, because state officials are making decisions that are impacting state dollars being invested in the military. And just a small example is that now every session we are passing a bill to support veterans, and I think that's very important to support veterans. But I think part of that is this pressure for elected officials to always support the military. So imagine if part of the way supporting veterans was free college for all veterans, which doesn't really exist. Some people say it does. Imagine if it was universal health care access for all veterans, which certainly doesn't exist. If we could make that frame, I think we could really change that conversation with our state and federal elected officials. Thanks again for having me. I appreciate it. So, as far as the gentleman who flagged that, I think it's Hanscom is involved with a contract for nuclear weapons. So I wasn't aware of that, but certainly to send me that information, and that's certainly something that state officials can oppose. I know I've worked directly with Cole the past 2 weeks on a resolution from state legislators opposing war in Iran. So we've been working on that directly. And I do think it's important that, yes, state officials really should be involved in that conversation. On the Raytheon bill, so there is a bill to divest for the state pension from Raytheon. I believe I'm a co-sponsor. We've had an event at the State House to talk about a number of bills around divestment. So I do think I do think we need to do that. You know, there's also been the investment to divest from fossil fuel companies from our state pension. And so, you know, I think what a wonderful statement to sort of divest from all of those sort of instruments of war, climate change, et cetera. So I certainly support that. And I think there does need to be more organizing done on that. As far as related to Medicare, so I'm actually the author of an act to establish Medicare for all in Massachusetts. And so I think making that frame about how that could, you know, money, whether state or federal, could be used to expand and guarantee universal health coverage in Massachusetts, I think would be very, very powerful. And I think that's answering all the questions, unless I missed one. So thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm taking a question on Medicare for all, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture of violence question. So on Medicare for all, there's kind of a two-part answer, and they're both more about Medicare for all than they are about cutting Pentagon spending. But so I think you're possibly asking this question because I've suggested that cutting $350 billion could be one way to help pay for Medicare for all. So there's two things. One is that there are different estimates of how much Medicare for all would cost. And it depends on what the features of Medicare for all would be, and it depends on things like our estimates of what we'll be spending if we don't have Medicare for all. So there are differences in both of those things. There are some estimates from places that, you know, I would give some credit, like the Urban Institute, for not being against Medicare for all, that have higher cost estimates for what it could potentially cost. So there are scenarios where we might need to make up some difference in money. Then there are scenarios that come from studies like the UMass Perry Institute study, which is what we cited most visibly in the Poor People's Campaign moral budget, that say that we'll save money if we have Medicare for all. But the important thing about that is that we're saving money for the whole economy, for everybody, but we're not saving money for the federal government. There's no scenario of Medicare for all where we save money for the federal government. So there's some money that is not currently coming into the federal government that has to be brought in, and that's why, you know, all of the plans have plans for how and where they would raise taxes in order to bring that money into the federal government and pay for the plan. So if you can, even in a scenario where Medicare for all costs less than what we have now, if you can kind of lessen the pain of bringing that money into the federal government by cutting some money somewhere else, that still seems like it's, you know, politically a smart thing to do. The other thing is that, of course, we don't have to cut the Pentagon to pay for Medicare for all. We could cut the Pentagon to pay for clean energy and dealing with climate change. There's so many things that we need that money for. So, you know, if Medicare for all doesn't seem like the most solid case, then, you know, I think clean energy, frankly, is I think, easily a top contender. It's hard to say that anything else deserves to be above that in terms of what we need to redirect that money toward. And then on the culture of violence, so this is something that the Poor People's Campaign has really been working on, and that we actually worked on a couple of years ago with an organization called Community Change, that's an umbrella organization for different activist groups. Is sort of connecting our military, not just the spending, not just the money, but connecting sort of the values and, you know, how we sort of approach the world and problems that are in our world, between the military and war, and between, you know, the prison industrial complex and our approach to immigration and so many other things. The school to prison pipeline, it sort of snowballs. And so I think we're kind of early still in making that connection, but there are people who are working on it. The Poor People's Campaign is all about not just, you know, ending war and the war economy and ending poverty, but the fact that those things are connected, and that racism is connected and environmental degradation is connected, and that you can't solve any of those things without considering all of them. And I think that's, you know, it's a tough framework because it's not super simple, but that's what the Poor People's Campaign is very much about. And the way that campaign is talking about both the dollars and the sort of values, I think is very much in keeping with that. So if you haven't checked out the Poor People's Campaign, I would suggest that.
Well, first, just wanted to say a thank you to every panelist that came before this panel. I think Bill set us up nicely when he said we have these conversations and then we say, well, what will we do about them? And when I was a younger activist working on anti-genocide, we were often taught that you could frame things by the what, the so what, and the now what. And I'm thinking, the structure of this conference is very much designed in that way, and that we've talked about the military-industrial complex and kind of what it means, where some of this funding is going, and now are thinking more specifically in Massachusetts with the Elephant in the Room project and beyond, what steps can we be taking, and why is this such a salient time to be taking them? And it's kind of that action plan. So I'm so excited to be connected with Elephant in the Room and all of you here. I am based at Public Citizen in Washington, D.C., and am a part of a coalition of groups. We now have about 25 progressive organizations that have signed on to a coalition called People Over Pentagon. And I think Lindsay has nodded to it, as has Bill. But it's a coalition of groups that are doing similar work. It's a mix of budget experts and think tanks in D.C. and issue area specific organizations working on climate justice, immigration, who all have an invested interest in reinvesting some of this money into other causes. So really the campaign is twofold in this, working hopefully from a grass tops perspective and grassroots perspective to get this conversation injected into particularly the presidentials, but also society writ large. So some of the strategies and what the session will be focused on is we have been meeting with and interfacing with and trying to influence the different presidential campaigns, which is a large part of what you will be trying to do here in Massachusetts as well. We've been trying to engage different sectors, so galvanizing a group of faith leaders, for example, to sign on to a statement in support of this, or climate justice activists who agree that divesting from the Pentagon and reinvesting in climate investments is, conducive to the change that we'd like to see in that area. We've been doing media engagement, which you will also be doing by way of op-eds and trying to, engage on every platform possible with this idea. And then very connected to some of your sessions later today on bird dogging. I have also been engaging in early primary states, so specifically Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, trying to directly access some of the presidential candidates by asking them questions on this and getting it into their consciousness a little bit more than it has been in the last few years. So the coalition is broad and wide-reaching and has a lot of different partners doing some of this work. NPP that Lindsay is with is a part of the coalition, a variety of other organizations that are here. But it's designed to be a coalescing of different organizations that believe in twofold slashing the Pentagon budget to a degree that is sizable and impactful. The number we are putting forward as a coalition is $200 billion, but we, as individual activists, also really support the $350 billion. The point is that it's large. We're calling for a large number, and then to talk about where that money could go. So very in sync with our other panelists talking about some of the very tangible trade-offs. We're trying to ask questions that both say, would you commit to cutting, say, $200 billion and reinvesting it in X? And so the hope is that people are engaging on this topic in both an overall need perspective and also in reinvestment. So we'll talk a little bit about the candidates. The coalition partners have been working since May. I came on in October, so some of these meetings I was not personally at, but we've been taking notes on them. Coalition partners, largely in DC, have been meeting with the policy teams of the campaigns. Getting us first doing a briefing, so saying budget experts have come up with this particular number. It's not arbitrary. Here's a list of the cuts that have been suggested. You can find that on peopleoverpentagon.org/guide to cuts. If you browse that website, all of the cuts that Bill helped put together and other coalition partners are listed there. So saying, actually, here are a lot of the places that this could be operationalized, it could be actively begun. This could easily be folded into a platform or a campaign. And then also encouraging them not only to kind of stump on this and mention it in their campaigning across the country, but to be very nuanced and specific. So please say this number, create a little bit of a snowball effect in that if one candidate is calling for very specific numbers, others maybe will too, or will engage with whether that's too high or too low. The whole point being that this is a time really to inject the narrative. And so we've had a lot of success with it. I've been asked to put together, and this is what you're holding, some of the readouts on 5. So Elephant in the Room requested 5 particular candidates, which are some of the front runners and their positions and our experiences with them. And I can go through them a little bit, and then we can also talk to some of the other meetings. So we've met with almost all of the campaigns. We've had trouble reaching Mayor Pete and his campaign, and we've also not met with Senator Klobuchar's team. But we have met with many of the candidates, including some which have now dropped out. But we met with Castro's team, we met with Senator Booker's team. What we've found as a general trend, and also I would encourage anyone who's been in these meetings as well to jump in, but we found that it's a palatable idea, like Lindsay nodded to. A lot of the campaigns are in general agreement, but the specifics are hard to come to or to get the campaigns to verbalize. Because there's not as much, it's a growing and galvanizing grassroots movement to call on them, but many of them have begun to speak on it, but without putting in any specific numbers or embedding it into plans. So Senator Sanders is actually in fairly regular contact. His team, I think, has a real pulse on this issue. He is the candidate probably who's spoken to ending endless wars most prolifically. He does fold in this concept of trade-offs into a lot of his speeches, both saying we have other priorities to fund, and this is where some of this money can go to, and just generally calling out militarism writ large. So he tends to speak on it. We've had some difficulty getting him to say a specific number. In general, his plans are very ideological and ideas based and very values driven, and we're working on trying to get a number. So I know Arnie Alpert will be doing a great session on bird dogging, but some of the bird dogging questions we've been suggesting for him are, you speak about this very frequently, it's wonderful, could you commit to this number, or what do you think of this number? So engaging with specifics. Senator Warren's team is one of the teams that's actually folded in a military cut. So the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, which we were looking at a little bit earlier on Nita's slides, she and her team have folded that in, cutting that specific account into their plan for how to pay for Medicare for all. So that's an $80 billion a year cut, obviously smaller than $200 billion or $350 billion, which are some of the larger numbers that our budget experts have come to, but it is a part of the conversation, and she often uses language like taking a knife, to the budget, or does reference cuts. But again, without this size of a committed number. And so suggested questions, if you were bird dogging at a Warren event, would be, we noted and we celebrate that you've folded this cut into, your existing Medicare for All plan. Will you cut more? Will you commit to this number? So again, you'll notice a trend in that, the request is to ask for specifics, to nod to the fact that this is a good step, but to get more of a hard commitment. But there is some nuance amongst candidates about how you may push and kind of demonstrate knowledge of their existing platforms. Vice President Biden, and Bill did mention this earlier, largely has not committed to cuts. We did have a larger meeting with his team where a senior advisor indicated that they believed the vice president would be, receptive to cuts or wouldn't be wholly, opposed to it. But there is nothing right now written or in his policies that indicate that it's a priority of his. He has mentioned loosely in a few examples the Pentagon budget as being large, but he has folded it into several times statements on how other social programming priorities are exorbitant in his mind. So he's said things, we've bird dogged him, and we've had some interactions where he said, even if you cut the entire Pentagon budget, it still wouldn't pay for Medicare for all. And so there is kind of an acknowledgement that the Pentagon budget is large and excessive, but as not, a lot of his language is on, we need to be, preparing, doing smart spending, preparing for, advancements in cyber, defending against China. It's been stumping on a lot of the threats that we may expect to see, and hasn't explicitly said that cuts need to be made. I will say for him and for Mayor Pete, there's a lot of dancing around the idea that potentially we would need to reinvest or change our allocations, but there has not been, and someone can jump in if you've heard statements or otherwise. We're trying to meticulously track it, but obviously they're saying new things every day. But to this point in the campaign, we haven't heard a commitment to cut. Following that, and I think Bill nodded to, Mayor Pete was actually the one who was asked a Pentagon spending question in one of the debates, the November televised debate. Rachel Maddow asked him about this. Mayor Pete is similar to Vice President Biden in his responses. He largely focuses on, it's not, how much we invest, but how. We don't love that answer. We would like tangibles, and we would like to know how much we will invest. And so we've been working pretty hard to encounter both of these campaigns and get them onto a more specific track, even saying cuts, which the former two that I was discussing have at least committed to. There's been a lot of rhetoric around this current president uses moats and alligators and these outdated methods. We need smart security, but no real discussion of the budget. And so if you were to attend either of these candidates, but specifically Mayor Pete event, you could ask, you've spoken a great deal about foreign policy and the need for smart investments, but in our view that is a less decreased investment. Would you commit to reinvesting at least $200 billion, right? So you can see how the questions can be framed based on some of your context of what they've answered, but again pointing out specifics. And then Senator Klobuchar in your booklet has the smallest briefer because she hasn't really spoken on this in great detail. There have been several polls, and some of them have differing answers, but I know that a Washington Post and I believe a Politico questionnaire, when other candidates had kind of paragraphs written out about their stances, Senator Klobuchar has just said, Senator Klobuchar's staff has said that she supports defense industry cuts. And so there is kind of a nod to support, but again, no real specifics. It hasn't been fleshed out in detail. So again, if you were attending one of those events, you could simply say, you haven't defined, a detailed position on this, and we'd like to see it. What could it possibly be? $200 billion in cuts? And so thinking about all of the different candidates in that way, you can kind of tailor your pushes on them and to what response you would like them to get, and use the knowledge of what they've already said. So that's a little bit of a breakdown of 5 candidates. Of note, Tulsi Gabbard has spoken on this, again with no numbers. She's put out a few videos that have said, as former military, I see that we're not investing or appropriately paying for the health care of our troops when they come home. How can we, invest in waging endless war when we're not taking care? And so that's an angle that I know she has spoken on, although again, no number. And I think Andrew Yang is the only other candidate that has written a cut into a plan. He doesn't speak about it a great deal, but on his website he does have a $60 billion cut that he then says he would directly channel into an infrastructure fund. And so that's something that you could ask about, that specific policy, and if he'll speak about it more, if he'll up the number. But largely, so that's kind of a zoom in on each of the candidates and their campaigns and our attempts to work with them directly, and how you can kind of add to that pressure as a citizen engaging in their candidate events. Zooming out a little, and I think this is what Tony will speak to in great detail as well, is the reason why we're taking this approach rather than a congressional one right now, and as kind of galvanize citizen groups, is that the primaries, and particularly the Democratic primaries right now, are a real time to engage in and build up progressive support for this idea. So Lindsay was speaking a little bit to the timing and how the next administration could have a window for kind of wide-scale reprioritizing, and that's kind of the thought process behind bird dogging specifically presidential candidates. The idea being we want people not only to vote on these domestic priorities that we're talking about, healthcare, infrastructure, climate, justice, but also to vote on whether or not the Pentagon budget will be used decisively to fund some of these priorities or more judiciously. And so the hope is both that there will be hearing it from kind of a mobilized constituency in DC that's doing some of the policy back-end work, but also from people on the campaign trail, that this becomes an issue that is embedded as part of a progressive platform. And so the coalition of organizations working on this in DC are kind of all contributing different components of this. And then we're working with folks to bird dog and to write op-eds and to do as much engagement on it as possible. Yeah, I will turn it. So, I mean, we were thrilled. We've been working on this for the last few months and in coordination with a lot of the other groups. And we were so thrilled to learn we saw a local op-ed actually published by Elephant in the Room Project here in Massachusetts and got connected. And it sounds amazing, like lightning struck twice. And there's a group here in Massachusetts doing very similar and amplifying work. And so we're really excited to support and to think about your all plans to attend different town halls and events between now and Super Tuesday, both here, potentially traveling to New Hampshire. So we're thrilled. Our door is open. Hopefully that is helpful. You can get more information on all of the guide to cuts, the specific candidates. We've put a lot of other local op-eds on our website, so there is kind of a hub that we're trying to create on this information. And we're just looking forward to planning for the rest of the day as you gear up for engaging in the primaries. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I will just add, before even trying to tackle some of these, that they're all great products of conversation and probably things that we should be discussing for the rest of the day as well. I can take a stab at some of them, but also know that we have a lot of wisdom in this room to engage on it as well. To the economy is doing so well point, I know the angle that I take in response to that, and I think that there are probably 10 viable angles you can take to it. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, especially when engaging on the military budget and kind of skewed priorities, is I just point out that, despite kind of raw numbers and an economy doing well, things like wages have not increased in, a vast period of time, that we are still facing kind of exponential inequality and that it's growing. I try to point out that a lot of the things that we're arguing that this budget could be reinvested into are components of human security that are lacking. And so I try to point to some of the discrepancies that, yes, the economy, in terms of GDP may be growing or really succeeding right now, but that not all key players or stakeholders within the country are benefiting. And this is a way that we could, one of many, to the point of having many different methods and approaches, one of many ways that we could try to tip those scales back a little bit. So I think probably many people have ways to engage that and could offer them, but that is the way that I personally, in conversations with folks, try to engage it. On the TV spots promoting, not a product but a policy, I feel that. I started this job in October, and the first week on the job, I was getting Twitter ads for F-35 Lightning jets. So I definitely truly understand and am terrified by the amount that our media infrastructure is infiltrated by the defense industry. I think something that I think the question within that is, how do we combat it? It ties back to the culture question. How do we create a society that's a little bit more resilient to messaging like that and ready to push back with an anti-war perspective? I think a lot about some of the polling that we've been using, citizen polling that we've been talking about within our campaign. There were some polls that were run that had people answer, very tangibly, what are the things that keep you up at night? What do you worry about as a citizen? And people were answering things like, their health care, their ability to pay for, insurance or medication that they needed, their ability to keep their jobs, their, family members' safety and security on a day-to-day basis, the rise of hate in the United States. And I think when thinking about kind of war and militarism being branded to us as consumers and as Americans, I try to make the point with people, and I think we would do well to have a rhetorical pivot into thinking about, we talk about the military as protecting us from these large threats and helping promote our station as the good guys with capital G's. But a lot of the things that really, and I haven't even mentioned climate change, but obviously that's an existential threat of the majority of the world. I think pointing out that these are some of the components of human security that we don't always fold into our thoughts about what makes us safe, and that actually reaches beyond what the military can provide. We need a more robust multi-sector and citizen-engaged response to these threats. Obviously, that doesn't solve the problem of these industries being able to really infiltrate and engage in this way and sell war, but it does create a little bit more of a robust counter narrative that there are other things that we would do well to be mobilizing and engaging in, that we proactively would like this type of society, and not only we want to dismantle militarism. So again, multiple perspectives, but that's something that I try to emphasize, and also to the popularity. How do we make this a popular idea? Actually, we found, and this is one polling sample of many, but that when asked very explicitly, do you support reinvesting this amount of the Pentagon into domestic and human needs priorities, was the language that we used, and then said like healthcare, infrastructure, education, etc. Actually, a majority, I think it was 52% of Americans said yes, just with that direct trade-off, and that 2/3 of Democratic primary voters, which is critical in terms of engaging in campaigns, said yes, that they supported that. So it had a specific number in it and a suggestion of where that could go. And I think also bringing up and socializing the idea that if you really think about it, it is a popular idea. It's just not one that we often have in our consciousness. I think that's another way too, is to create a compelling alternative. And tying into the third question about might it be a more strategic approach or another approach to get at the root of, it's not only shuffling funding around, but it is also this pervasive culture of war. I think I would just say yes, and that is absolutely the case, and there are a lot of robust, amazing anti-war groups that are galvanizing around this issue. You can see the recent mobilization against escalation in Iran as an example. People over Pentagon, and would just add, there are people that are doing bird dogging and have drafted questions and things that address this more systemic approach, but also the funding and the budget is systemic as well. And so I think people over Pentagon is simply being one approach, one very kind of wonky, get the numbers out there, socialize the idea that, this, a 200 billion or more cut out of a nearly 800 billion budget is actually very reasonable and should have been done, a long time ago. It shouldn't have even increased to this amount. So I think, to your answer, I agree. It absolutely is, indicative of a broader culture and a broader, explanation. We're not just trying to winnow the military. We're trying to really get at why it exists and operates in the way that it does, and why it, has such a money funnel towards it. I think there are ways that you could ask both. You could say, we have this pervasive and large money suck industry that is doing X and X objective that we don't adhere to as Americans. Cutting that's a part of it. Would you cut it? And also, how would you ensure that our objectives shift strategically? So I think there are ways to do both, and I think they're both really powerful. I think the value add of this organization and of people over Pentagon is just, no one has been asking specifics, and perhaps if you can get a specific, you can pinball candidates off each other, and you can start to get a more, solid plan firming up. So thank you to everyone. Those are great questions, and I'm sure you all have your own takes on them, but that's some thoughts. Would you like to do that? Oh, you guys.
Well, I'll just add just to that last question, because I think it is interesting that, why aren't we talking more about what is the role of the military versus how can we cut the military? And I think that's because it's difficult to raise that question. I don't see a poll that says, do you support the U.S. imperial strategies around the world? Do you support the use of military to protect our resources, our oil. When those questions start to come, then we can, raise the other question of the purpose of the military. We have an opportunity, and I think because of folks like people over Pentagon, because of the Poor People's Campaign, and because of what some of the work being done here in Massachusetts, to talk about the military through the relationship to the cuts and what we're missing, right? And that's the key. And that people, as Savannah said, in terms of those polls, it's clear, right, that people do see a relationship. So we want to build on that relationship. At one point, maybe we can talk about, the root of why we have such a large military. But for now, we should be focusing on how we can reduce that military and how do we use the funds, which is exactly what we want to ask our candidates to do. Just wanted to follow up on that. I don't have the content that the other panelists have, but I do want to spend the last few minutes here before we get into the breakout to talk a little bit about the project and what we really want you to do. In order for me to do this, I need each of you to have a packet. So if you don't have a packet, I'm going to really ask that you get one. And if you don't have a pen, sit next to someone who does. Everyone have one? All right, so before I talk about the packet, I want to express some appreciation. I do want to say that I appreciate the fact that people have given me, say that this was my brainchild, the Elephant in the Room project. I want to actually put a shout out to a very close friend who helped me formalize this in some way, and who both Bill and Nina work with. And that is a friend of mine, Carl Canetta, who like Nina and like Bill for 40 some odd years. This is how old we are. For 40 some odd years have been working on issues of militarism, peace, justice, and justice. So a shout out to Carl. I want to thank the four groups that make up this campaign. The Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, New England American Friends Service Committee, Watertown Citizens for Peace and Justice, the Environment, the group that I work with, Mass Peace Action Education Fund, and of course Survival Education Fund. I want to thank them. This idea came, we had a little bit of money, and this idea kind of blossomed into this project. The idea of addressing military spending blossomed into the Elephant in the Room project. But it would not be possible to do this work that we're doing in this short-term campaign without the support of a number of people. So a shout out to the Mass Peace Action staff. I want to thank Cole, Brian, and Carol for their amazing contributions to help give us the foundation to move this project forward. I want to also thank our two staff people, Eustace and Steve Powell. Maybe you could just take a stand up a little bit there and give them for their great work on this project. And I also want to thank Maryellen for her excellent, not only facilitating us throughout this morning, but for her framing of the issue early on. I really found that to be very helpful. So in your packet, you will see a description of the Elephant in the Room project. And what we are trying to do is to raise the issue of military spending to the candidates as they approach the March 3rd Democratic primary here in Massachusetts. The project itself had three components. One is a media component, which I'll come back to. One is this conference, and the third component is what we're going to call, in a larger sense, for the time being, bird dogging. Our goal, our ultimate goal, was to get the candidates to address the issue of military spending One, how they would cut the budget specifically. Two, and three, how would they use the money? Those were the goals. Very, very good. Address the issue, but specifically address it, how you would cut it, where would you put it? That is our goal. Now, we have thought about this through the media effort, which is op-eds in try to get op-eds in the daily papers in Massachusetts, as well as in the local weekly papers in Massachusetts, to get folks on radio and TV shows, whether that be mainstream radio and TV shows or college radio TV shows. And that was the first piece. The second piece was this conference, to get people to participate in the project, and I'm coming back to that. And the third piece is this idea of bird dogging. But I want to first just point out, we've been successful already, and that's because of the willingness of some folks. You know, people will in the dailies in Massachusetts, you need a hook of some way to get your op-ed placed. But you also need some folks who have some credentials. And we've been reaching out to folks like Bill and Nina and a few other folks who have some credentials, who have written something recently or who have done a study. And Bill, I'm happy to say, he's always, you'll see his stuff all over, but we're happy to say that his op-ed piece, which he wrote for us, appeared in the Berkshire. Is it Berkshire Journal? Berkshire Eagle. We want to do more of that. You know, there's a lot of dailies in Massachusetts. So we're reaching out to some other folks who have credentials to write op-ed pieces for us around this, and to mention the project in the room, and to focus on asking candidates to address the issue. In your packet also is a press release that we did just simply to explain what, and thanks to you for doing this, which we sent out to all the 400 media outlets that we had access to through MAPPA's media list. On the left side of it, you'll see this People Over Pentagon Grassroots Toolkit. I think some of this will be referred to in the workshop on bird dogging, but it also, and media, both of them. But this is an excellent piece on how to write an op-ed and how to write a letter to the editor. And then finally, we've given you some concrete examples. There are three basic pieces of material that we've used in this campaign. One is CIP's, the Center for International Policy, that Bill and Nina related are part of, or Bill's part of, and Nina contributed to their Sustainable Defense Project. That particular publication, which called for a $150 billion cut per year. We also referred to the re-imaging of U.S. security spending for the 21st century, which is part of the Win Without War project, and we used their data. And finally, we used the data for the $350 billion cut that is in the People's. Thank you. The moral budget of the Poor People's Campaign. But in this particular one, you will see a nice piece that will help you write letters. And it is security spending in today and tomorrow, which gives some specific figures of how you could cut the budget and what specifically you could use it for. But you can look at any of the pieces that Bill or Nina have done, and you will find some of these comparisons. So now, to the very specific of what we get you to do. Take out this piece that says elephant in the room in our excellent letterhead, as you see the elephant spurting dollars all over the Pentagon. It says, get involved. This is where you need your pen and your pencil. What we need from you is to make a commitment. What we need from you is to make a commitment to do something to help this short-term project which, you know, is focused on the March 3rd primary to be a success. And again, our success is measured by how the candidates speak to the issue of military spending. That's how we measure our success. The components of that success is how do we get the media to address the issue, because we think if the media addresses the issue, the campaigns will be aware of it. Mm-hmm. And then the third way that we do that is through our presence at candidates' events. So, is it hard to write an op-ed? Well, you may not be able to write an op-ed like Nina or Linda Blimis or Bill, but you can write an op-ed. And we've given you some of the data to make it. Right? What your op-ed says is why you think military spending should be cut and how you should use it. And there's enough information of the facts and figures to help you do that. An op-ed in your local paper is as important as Bill putting another op-ed in the Boston Globe. And I know that you say, well, that really, I mean, people read the Globe. Right? Well, people read your local paper. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you think that you want a shorter piece, and it would be easier for you to write a shorter, then write a letter to the editor. Write a letter to the editor. What you want to say is simply, we have a bloated military budget. It should be cut, and the funds should be used for X, Y, and Z. So if you don't feel like you can write a longer op-ed, which I think you can, I think everybody in this room could, they put their mind to it. I also think that you all could write a letter to the editor, and that could go into your local paper, into your regional paper, and into your daily paper. All right? So you have a daily paper in Lowell, write a letter to the editor to Lowell. You have a daily paper in Springfield, write a letter to the editor. You have a local weekly paper in Watertown, write an op-ed. You have a weekly paper in Salem, write an op-ed. You have a weekly paper in Quincy, well, you have a daily in Quincy, write a letter to the editor. Most importantly, though, not most importantly, but equally important, we need you to sign up for the rapid response team. We need you to check off, show up on short notice when candidates speak at public events. We need you to be able to be there on short notice with our two banners, our 12-foot banners. Our 12-foot banners that say $738 billion is an election issue. Candidates speak out. That's what we need you to do. We will have banners like that, which we're going to produce. We're going to possibly have them for today, possibly have them, but we're unable to get them done by today. And we'll have another banner that says, you know, billions of dollars for war instead of Green New Deal, health care for all, and so forth. So we need you to be able to say on short notice, Warren is having an event at the Faneuil Hall. We want to be at that Warren event in Faneuil Hall, standing out in front of Faneuil Hall with our signs. All right? We need you to check off, show up on quick notice. And finally, we would love some more help. And I know the two staff people would still love some more help in the office. We have a lot to do. We're trying to call every local daily paper and all the local papers. We're trying to get folks, as I say, to write these op-eds and write the letters to the editor. They could use a lot of help. So I would hope that you could check off. All four of these are manageable tasks. All four of them are very manageable tasks. On the right side, put your name, your email, and your phone, and the city that you work on. Let me ask you to do this, because what we have seen today is the results of people's many hours of work. The work that Bill put into this, into his work, the work that Nina puts into this, the work that Senator Jamie Eldridge puts into his work, the work that Lindsay puts into her work, the research, the time, the energy that they put into it, the work that Savannah, and I can't believe she's only started since October, the work that she's put into it. They gave us our job is to take their work and to carry it on. And to carry it on in the media, to carry it on at candidates' events. We should feel obligated to do something with the work that they've done. And I'm asking you to do that. Take the work that they've done and do something with it. Let's have an impact on the Democratic primary here in Massachusetts. Thank you. Unfortunately, no. The project was focused, again, it's a very short-term project. It started in November. I'm not sure, amazing how much we've been able to pull together in that short period of time. But no, we're not. But that doesn't mean you can't.
Yes. Yeah.
Take the information that's in your packet, look up a little more information, go to one of these workshops, go to Jonathan King's about Massachusetts spending, take a question or two, go and raise it. But unfortunately, our bandwidth is not.
Just wondering.
Yeah.
It's a great idea.
Adding to that quickly, too, if you are going to bird dog a non-presidential, particularly a congressional official, I would look up whether or not they voted for the most recent NDAA, so the National Defense Authorization Act, and you can just bring up their vote because a lot of votes were yes. So that is a way to plug that quickly if you are going to bird dog there.
I don't think I'm not saying it's not a good issue, and I do want to point you to a forum that we're doing in, well, not my group, but another group in Watertown are doing on ranked choice voting. It's being done by the Progressive Watertown, which is part of the larger Progressive Massachusetts, and that'll be in March. You can go on the Progressive website to find it. I think it's an important issue, but again, our focus is really on getting folks to get candidates to speak to this issue, on military spending, how much they would cut and where they would put it. And we don't have much time, but that's where we're focused right now. That's an interesting possibility. We do have a Facebook page that Eust has set up, and we are going to try to do more work through it. We haven't talked about the issue of taking out ads. That might be, I'm not sure our budget can allow that, but we will use the Facebook platform to talk about the campaign.
Yeah, I can add to that loosely just from people over Pentagon and what we're working on. We've definitely discussed that Facebook is and a lot of the social media platforms are where a lot of election rhetoric are. For better or for worse, our social media team at Public Citizen has been trying to kind of collate a lot of the different articles and things that people are doing and put them on those platforms just by way of engaging people who are only getting their news from there. Similarly, our budget is constrained in terms of if we were to really make, a giant splash of this, it would be pay to play and you'd pay for every ad you put out. But we have, as a campaign, discussed whether some of our resources should go into producing something like an evergreen video that just explained, the military industrial complex and presented it as an election issue, and then, put that out or did some sort of advertising around it. So that is something that is in the works, one of many of the lines of effort. And if we do come out with something like that and begin airing it, we will definitely point it to everyone's send it along, and then you would be able to share it and engage with it. But yeah, in terms of the mass level of ads, we haven't been able to engage that way.
I'm talking about this focus in March. I do say that I know the Mass Peace Action wants to take this on afterwards. So I've been really focused because that's what this particular short-term campaign, which only has X amount of money to do. But I know that this issue of military spending, reorientation of our priorities, our national priorities, is a major issue for Mass Peace Action, and they will continue to do the work. I know they will continue to do it, and just want to put a note that this is not the end, but this is a step in the process of doing it. Go enjoy the work breakouts, and thank you for coming.
Yes.